Hello, welcome to today's Dynacraft Quick Tip. I'm Jeff Jackson. Today we'll go through the assembly operations involved in building a 5-iron. The materials that we'll need to build a 5-iron are set forth on the table in front of me. The parts necessary to assemble today's 5-iron include the parts for the club itself. Those parts are the grip, the head, the ferrule, and the steel shaft. The equipment necessary for the assembly process itself include a shaft cutter with which to cut the shaft, a piece of medium to coarse grit sandpaper with which to abrade the shaft, a permanent marker to mark the shaft prior to cutting, a ferrule installation tool to make ferrule installation easier, a vinyl shaft clamp to hold the club in the vise during assembly, 24-hour cure epoxy and an epoxy mix stick to mix the epoxy prior to securing the head of the shaft, double-sided grip tape and masking tape to help in the gripping operation, non-flammable grip solvent to secure the shaft to the head, paper towels for miscellaneous cleanup, as well as a 48-inch ruler or a true measure to measure the club after assembly. To measure the finished length of the assembled golf club, we use this device known as a true measure. The steps involved in any iron assembly are as follows. Initially, the shaft, head, and grip selection must be made. After the selection is made, proper trimming of the shaft must occur. To determine proper trimming, you must identify the shaft and look in the Dynacraft catalog under the proper trimming charts. Once the trimming chart is determined, the shaft must be marked, followed by the cutting of the shaft. Today, we're going to cut the shaft using a tubing cutter. After the shaft is cut, we're going to rough up or abrade the tip of the shaft. This will make for good epoxy adhesion between the shaft and the head. Next, epoxy must be mixed prior to ferrule installation. After the epoxy is mixed, a bit of the epoxy is placed on the shaft tip, the ferrule is placed over the shaft tip, and the shaft installation tool is used to slide the ferrule into place. Next, epoxy is applied into the club head hosel and onto the shaft tip. The shaft tip is put into the club head hosel, rotating it as it is inserted. This ensures adequate epoxy coverage to both the club head hosel and to the shaft. Once this is done, grip solvent along with a paper towel can be used to wipe off any excess epoxy residue. The club head is now ready for gripping and swing weighting. The first step in today's assembly is selection of the steel shaft. After the shaft is selected, we must consult the Dynacraft shaft trimming tables in the catalog. We have predetermined that 2 inches is the proper amount to tip this steel shaft in our assembly. Once that particular point is marked with a permanent marking pen, we can take the shaft and with approximately 6 inches of shaft tip extending through the vise, position the shaft in the vinyl shaft clamp and tighten that shaft clamp in the vise. Once we have the shaft properly positioned in the vise, we take our shaft cutter, opening it up, securing it on the shaft at the proper location where we previously made our mark. We tighten the shaft cutter and rotate the shaft cutter around the shaft. Depending upon the thickness of the shaft and the sharpness of the shaft cutter, this may take a few turns or may take as many as 10 or 20 turns. Once the shaft breaks off, we are now in a position to abrade the shaft. To determine the proper abrasion point, we take the club head and position it on the shaft, making sure it bottoms out in the hosel. We then take our ferrule and hand position it at the top of the hosel. We make a mark on the shaft approximately halfway up the ferrule. This is for 2 reasons. One is, it allows us to abrade the shaft underneath the ferrule to assure maximum shaft to ferrule adhesion, and 2, it provides a marking point so that when we are sanding the shaft, we do not sand the shaft up too far above either the top of the hosel or above the top of the ferrule. We use our mark as a reference point, and using a shoe shine type of motion, we sand the tip of the shaft, removing all of the chrome plating. The next step in our assembly process is the installation of the ferrule, followed by the installation of the club head. To properly mix the epoxy, we are going to mix the epoxy on a piece of 2-inch masking tape. We take the masking tape and position it along the edge of the table, followed by placing 2 beads of 24-hour epoxy, approximately 1 inch long, on the masking tape. We use part A and part B in equal amounts. Once we have equal amounts of epoxy on our tape, we simply take a mixing stick, which is small enough to fit inside the hosel of the golf club, and mix the epoxy together for a period of about 15 seconds. Once the epoxy is mixed to this point, we are ready to begin ferrule installation and head installation on the pre-abraded shaft. The first step in ferrule installation is to apply some epoxy to the shaft tip. This is done for two purposes. One, it will serve to hold the ferrule in place after the shaft and head are put together, and two, it will help the ferrule slide up the shaft during the use of the ferrule installation tool. Once we have the ferrule in place on the tip of the shaft, we remove the shaft and the vinyl shaft clamp from the vise, position the ferrule over the appropriate sized hole, the larger one in this case, as this is an iron shaft, in a ferrule installation tool. Simply apply some pressure on the shaft, sliding the ferrule into place along the shaft. The next step in our 5-iron assembly is the epoxy installation step. We take our shaft tip and rotate it in the epoxy that we've placed on the 2-inch masking tape along the side of the bench. We then also take the club head, and using our epoxy mixing stick, we lightly coat the inside of the hosel of the golf club. We then take the shaft, position it in the hosel, and rotate it in the hosel, ensuring adequate epoxy bond between head and shaft. We make sure that the shaft is covered as well as the inside of the hosel is covered. We then take a piece of paper towel that has been wet with grip solvent, wipe it over the head, the shaft, and the ferrule, removing any excess epoxy. The golf club is now ready to be cut to length, to have the grip installed, and to be swing weighted as other steps of our Dynacraft Quick Tip series. To recap the steps in our successful 5-iron assembly. Initially, we chose a head, shaft, grip, and ferrule. Next, we located the proper shaft trimming and trimmed the shaft according to the tip trimming instructions found in the Dynacraft catalog. We then abraded the shaft tip, installed the ferrule, and installed the shaft into the club head using 24-hour cure epoxy. We then made sure that the entire installation of the shaft, head, and ferrule had no epoxy residue on it by wiping the head clean, the shaft clean, and the ferrule clean with grip solvent. Thank you for listening to this Dynacraft Quick Tip. Other quick tips can be referenced at www.dynacraftgolf.com.